With that short introduction, now let me introduce the panelists. And if I could ask them to come on stage as I introduce them. Let me first start with Professor Kishore Mahbubani. Professor, I think he doesn't need an introduction, but he is the Dean of the Lee Kuan Yew School of Public Policy. He is one of the leading thinkers and has been voted one of the leading thinkers on foreign policy and such matters multiple times. So it's an honor to have you with us. Dr. Supachai. Dr. Supachai was the leader of UNCTAD, which is the UN Conference for Trade and Development, for a number of years. Yes, please, sir. He's also a Director General of the WTO, as well as Deputy Prime Minister of Thailand for a number of years. Gita, do I see you? Welcome. Gita is the founder and chairman of Ancora Capital. It's a private equity fund, sizable, with owns a number of companies in Indonesia. He's also the former trade minister of Indonesia. And many other accomplishments as well we won't get into. Last but not least, Dato Sri Wahid. Dato Sri Wahid is a minister in the Prime Minister's office, responsible for economic planning, and the former CEO of Maybank and many other roles. Welcome. Ladies and gentlemen, please give them a big hand. I have one housekeeping note to make. I think each one of you has a red thing like this, a little card. We're going to do polling, and there will come up questions asking you to reply to on this poll. So if you could just read and follow the instructions on that poll, you can have an opportunity to participate. Very good. Let's get into it, gentlemen. I want to start with a rapid fire round. And if I could ask each of you to answer in maximum 2 sentences in this rapid fire round, and then you'll have an opportunity to dig deeper later. We have had a lot of talk, there's a lot of hype perhaps around ASEAN, around the AEC. Is it worth the hype? Perhaps we'll start from this end. Professor.
I think ASEAN needs more hype and not less hype. Because I think ASEAN, I will maintain, is one of the most underrated organizations in the world. It's actually a living, breathing, modern miracle. At a time when you travel around the world, when you go to Davos, all you get is pessimism around the world. You come to Southeast Asia, you get sunshine. Why? Because of ASEAN.
Thank you. Dr. Supachai.
In 2 sentences, the hype is correct. If you consider the default of all the other economic groupings that are doing so abominably bad, like the EU, NAFTA, the Mercosur. So because of default. But in order to earn and deserve the epitaph of hype into the future, much more needs to be done in terms of implementation, practical implementation of all the promises.
Thank you. Gita.
I think it deserves to be hyped up a lot more than it has been by way of the underrated peace and stability and economic robustness for the last 50 years. But I think in order for ASEAN to be at the next level, we need to start thinking not just about the opportunities, but I think of the long-term systemic risk that I think our kids and grandkids are going to be exposed to, as for us to be a much more sustainable proposition.
Thank you.
Definitely, I think ASEAN deserves more attention and more hype, but for that matter, 600 million people, $2.4 trillion US in terms of GDP, and growing consistently at 6% per annum. Great prospects. So we deserve more.
So now let's get into why. Let's talk about what do you see as some of the big opportunities over the coming, and if you don't mind focusing a little bit on the short term as opposed to the long-term outcomes. Over the next 1 to 2 years, what do you see as the opportunities? Dr. Sri.
Well, I think there's great opportunity for businesses to operate across ASEAN for sure. Speaking from my own experience in the 3 organizations that I have run, from the UM Group to telecoms to Maybank, we have seen great potential. And not just in the context of, say, the ASEAN banking integration framework, my view, that's got the biggest potential. We've spoken about this for a long, long time. And finally, just before the end of the year, the 2 central banks from Malaysia and Indonesia signed the heads of agreement that will pave the way for the first integrated ASEAN banking framework. And with that, we look forward to more ASEAN banks operating in each other's countries. And with ASEAN banks operating across the region, we'll see more businesses being integrated and more people being integrated in that manner.
But Gita, what are your views? And could you also elaborate, one, on the opportunity, but also some of the challenges or threats?
Well, I think the opportunities are great. You've got a $2.5 trillion basket. If you extrapolate it at 5% real growth per year for the next 20 years, you're looking at an accumulation of potentially 100 to 120 trillion US dollars. That's a lot of goods and services. But you zoom in to the intra-ASEAN trade, it's barely $500 billion US dollars in that basket of $2.5 trillion. So I think we've got to be able to communicate with each other a little bit better. That's only not for the purpose of selling spice from Thailand to Indonesia, but for the purpose of, I think, sustaining ourselves in the long term. Now, I think we only talk about opportunities, or we talk about opportunities a lot more often than we talk about risks. Nobody talks enough about how or why the fact that the damages for the 40 years preceding the year 2000 would have outpaced GDP growth in some parts of ASEAN. Nobody's talking about how we're going to be able to handle the management of natural disasters and the correlation between deforestation with climate change. I think this is what matters in the next 50 years. And I think we take it for granted that we've had peace and stability and prosperity the last 50 years, but I think there could be a black swan. The black swan could be in the next 5 to 10 years when some natural disaster or some climate change phenomenon might take place to the point where we're not going to be able to change. A good chunk of the population in Malaysia suffers from obesity. A good chunk of the population in Indonesia suffers from stunting. Not enough companies, not enough citizens of the world or citizens of the zone are talking about it and engaged in a conversation that I think would be value additive in terms of addressing the systemic risks of ASEAN.
Dr. Supachai, do you agree with Gita?
Yes, I think opportunities abound, and I would talk about the 3 major global trends that ASEAN as a community can make use of. The first trend is what we've been discussing at the World Trade Organization all along the last couple of years, that when we looked at the global trade scenario, it has changed into the new generation, which is predominated by the international network of production, the so-called global value chain. Now, the global value chain, 80% of the global value chain are owned by Asian, Chinese, Japanese, ASEAN. Now, this trend is something that ASEAN can take over, turning into this regional value chain that can aspire to be competitive at the global level. Particularly so at the moment now that a lot of these chains are moving away from China because of the rising costs in China, particularly wage costs, and some other trade impediments that China has been confronted with in the last couple of years. The second trend is the necessity for ASEAN economies to be moving away from the old traditional model of cheap labor, assembly plants, being at the end of the value chain. We have to change this model into one which we can balance between external competitiveness with domestic demand market that can enhance external competitiveness. I'm not saying that we have to enhance or expand our domestic consumption for the sake of consumption based on more borrowings by the private sector or by the consumers. In fact, we have some economies in ASEAN that are up to our ears in terms of private debts and borrowings, and we should avoid that. Now, domestic investment, domestic demand should be enhanced by domestic investment to upgrade external competitiveness. And this is a new model that we have been talking about. Prime Minister has talked about technology, human resource development, infrastructural investment. This is a second trend that I can see that ASEAN can make use of. And the last one, the third one, is that in the last couple of years, if you look at the global trade trend, normally trade trend would expand twice the size of the global output growth. So output growth will be 3%, trade will expand by 7%, 6%. But in the last couple of years, trade has been actually slowing down, not contracting, but while the world growth has been 2.5%, 3%, trade has been below 3% and below 2.5%. This is not going to change soon. This year, I don't presume that world trade will be expanding beyond 3%, for example. So what happens now is that what Dr. Surin has been talking about, what Prime Minister has been talking about, is that we need to be able to see to it that the static intra-ASEAN share of 25% for so many years, this has to change. And there are so many reasons that explain why we are stuck at 25%, and we can talk about it later on, but this has to go up from 25 to 35% in 5 or 6 years' time.
Just to pick up on this a little bit, one of the things I have heard over the last year plus, SMEs particularly are worried. And I think SMEs are important if we're going to get to some of this trade and the growth that you see. Gita, I think you lead several SMEs. There might be even growing out of the SME league already, but what is your sense from an SME angle?
Oh, I can speak for Indonesia. There is about 55 million SME entrepreneurs. Only 25 million of those have access to banking, to financing. So we're talking about the 35 million people who are entrepreneurial, supposedly, who don't have a bank account. How can we talk about making sure that Indonesia can be a proud member of the G20, a proud member of Southeast Asia, and sustainable when 35 million people out of the 55 million entrepreneurs, small and medium, don't have access to financing? I think that's a real issue. So I think there's some concerns with some countries in Southeast Asia, and especially when this gate opens up. There's still a lot of entrepreneurs in Indonesia who haven't even put an English label on their products. But there are some countries in Southeast Asia who have been putting 4 languages on their products because they're ready. When the gate opens up in December 31st of 2015, they're also learning how to speak Bahasa. Much less, we can't even speak in English in many parts of Indonesia. So I think there are issues, and it's going to create a dent, but I think it's a necessary lesson and reality that we have to go through. But at the end of the day, I think beyond that, I think we've got to be able to communicate a little bit better with each other. We can talk about cooperative competition, but if our trade consistently on an intra basis is only 25% of the basket, it's troublesome.
Dr. Sri, do you agree with this?
Well, there was a time when SMEs, businesses are confined to only their respective domestic market, but that's not true anymore. With greater connectivity, with internet, now these small businesses are able to then operate across the region at a much lower cost. And with internet, they're now able to sell online, and with improved connectivity and lower cost of exporting their products. So they are already doing a lot of businesses in the region. So I think as we move forward, I would say that the SMEs will be one of the biggest beneficiary from ASEAN economic community. not just directly, but also indirectly, as larger businesses also operate. So then they will then also be able to fit into the bigger businesses.
Thank you. So I would like to turn to you, Professor Kishore.
Sorry,
yes,
can
please.
I just add to what Gita
Yeah.
and just said? I think there is a lot of misconception what concern SMEs. In ASEAN context, formal policies that ASEAN states have been dealing with MNC are not going to be effective. Why? Because they are formal. While most of the SMEs are in the informal sector. SMEs in ASEAN must comprise about 80–90% of the total output, but most of them are in the informal sectors, in services sector, in entertainment, in creative economies. They're in the informal sector. So if we think of SME as part of the formal sectors and we use the normal, formal macroeconomic things, financial flows to deal with all these SMEs, we're not going to work out. So my recommendation is we have to look at that informal sector. Do not turn the informal sector into the formal sector, but find ways to go into the informal sector and help this, all these SME in the informal sector. So, sorry, thank you.
Thank you. And I think this is in the same spirit. Professor Kishore, I've heard you in the past lament that ASEAN has historically been a top-down project, if you will, and we need more bottom-up. How are we going to, bottom-up meaning more people involved, more businesses involved in driving this? How is that going to happen?
Yeah. Can I just comment on what's been said so far quickly? You know, I agree about the challenges that have been expressed. They're real, okay? But we must also emphasize that the window of opportunity for ASEAN over the next 2 decades is the biggest it's ever going to be for ASEAN. I mean, just 2–3 facts. You know, somebody said that ASEAN grows because it's attached to 2 jet engines. One jet engine is the Chinese economy, the next jet engine is the Indian economy. And the Chinese and Indian economies are going to grow around 6 to 7% over the next decade, comfortably. That's going to provide a huge boost. The size of the Asian middle class is going to go 3.5 times from 500 million in 2010 to 1.75 billion in 2020, an increase of 3.5 times in 10 years. That surge of the middle class is happening all around ASEAN. And whether you like it or not, the spillover benefits into ASEAN will be phenomenal. The tourism industry is going to explode. More people are going to fly into this region. And guess what? Southeast Asia is one of the most interesting touristic regions in the entire planet because you have more cultural diversity among the 600 million people in ASEAN than you have anywhere else in the world. So it's a fantastic window of opportunity that's happening. The challenge we have, and as you said, Oliver, is that so far, the ownership of the ASEAN project has been primarily with the leaders, and I'm glad that the reference was made to the fact that the Prime Minister's father was one of the launchers of this ASEAN project. He was one of the visionary leaders that drove ASEAN forward. The challenge we face is that on the one hand, in fact, we face 2 simultaneous big challenges for ASEAN this year. One is that the ownership of ASEAN has not percolated down to the people of ASEAN. In fact, the level of ignorance about ASEAN among the ASEAN populations is phenomenal. But the other danger we face, and here I'm being somewhat maybe a bit too candid than I should be, is that the current set of leaders of ASEAN don't seem to show the same level of commitment to ASEAN as the previous generations did. And at the same time, you know, because our political systems are all changing, we've gone from an era where you had very strong, decisive leaders who make decisions and move their countries forward to a greater democratization of our societies, and our leaders have become more internally preoccupied, taking care of their internal democratic challenges. And so that I see, frankly, as the big challenge in ASEAN, because if you're going to have a situation where you've relied on top-down leadership and the top-down doesn't come and the bottom-up is not ready, then frankly, it's time for the business community to take over the ownership of ASEAN.
Does this jive, Brother Street?
Yeah, I think absolutely. I think if you talk about, we need people to feel that they are part of ASEAN. And I think if you look at this booklet that Maybank and Bursa have prepared, they contain a lot of facts about ASEAN. And I think we have a lot more in common than we tend to appreciate. And I think it is time for a lot more efforts to be done so that people and businesses will feel that they are very much part of ASEAN. And later we could perhaps discuss how we can actually move forward to promote this further.
So, Gita, are you ready to take over the ASEAN as a representative of the business community?
As ready as anybody in this room.
Hey, we're counting on you, Gita.
Can I just get a time check? Because how much time do we have left? 2 minutes. Very good. So I have two overarching questions left. Number one, there's a rising consumer class, and now a lot of that consumer class is made up of millennials. I'm not quite sure which one of you is the closest to being a millennial.
I'm the oldest, I think.
But what do you see as some of the challenges and opportunities that rising consuming class, that growth of the millennials gives going forward? And could you also tell, if there were, what would your advice to the millennials in the room be?
So, go ahead, Kishore.
I think he's suggesting he's the closest to the millennials.
That's right. Go ahead.
Look, I mean, we do the math. I don't disagree with the notion that there is a huge opportunity ahead of us. The next 20 years, $100 trillion worth of accumulated GDPs, just for ASEAN. If you take 50% as being the consumptive propensity, we're talking about $50 trillion worth of goods and services that are going to be consumed by the Indonesians, Malaysians, Singaporeans, and all the other guys in Southeast Asia. That's a huge opportunity. But what if a good chunk of that is full of sugar? What if a good chunk of that is not giving enough protein to our kids? To the point where already today, 40% of Indonesia's population are stunting. And that percentage could go higher. We can talk about that $7 trillion of spending for infrastructure development. But if we're not addressing some of the basic healthcare related stuff, we're not going to have this 20-year run. We may have a 5 to 10-year run, but we're not going to be able to have that 20 to 30-year run. And I do think a part of the solution is fiscal for some countries in Southeast Asia. We're not going to be able to spend $7 trillion on high roads or highways and roads and railroads if many countries in Southeast Asia still have a tax ratio of around 13 to 15%. There's only 25 to 30 million people in Indonesia paying taxes out of a population of 250 million people. If the government does not start spending more or collecting more taxes, you can kiss whatever that number goodbye. We're just going to be having that presentation and not be able to reach that 7 trillion figure. Then it all trickles to all the other things that are going to serve as systemic risks in the long run.
Thank you. I'm going to change the question a little bit because we have some questions coming from the room too. How are we closing the socio-economic development gaps across the 10 member nations of ASEAN, from Ian in the room? Perhaps, Kishore, closing the socio-economic development gaps across the 10 nations.
Well, I think there's no doubt that the ASEAN region is one of the most unequal regions in the world in terms of the gap in per capita incomes between the highest in Southeast Asia and the lowest in Southeast Asia. But the lesson of history is that you cannot overcome this gap right away. The critical question is, are the people at the bottom still growing and developing, and do they see hope for themselves? And that's the big advantage of being in ASEAN, is that the people at the bottom feel that that their lives are going to get better within ASEAN. So I actually, if we didn't have ASEAN, I think they'd be in trouble. But because we have ASEAN, and because they can join ASEAN, and because ASEAN, as you know, has got several separate programs to give them more time to catch up and so on and so forth, I think they will succeed eventually.
What would you say, another question, what would you say is the biggest achievement ASEAN has done so far with regards to ASEAN economic integration from Nabila? Dr. Supachai, the biggest achievement ASEAN has done so far with regards to economic integration?
Well, I would say that if you look at the international tables for the rating of the so-called macroeconomic policies of countries around the world, I think ASEAN is one of the very few economic groupings around the world that has done their macroeconomic sum right. I mean, and this is probably because of the lesson that we have learned from the 1997-1998 crisis. That crisis has done us a lot of good. We have become a community that has been so mindful of, let's say, the indebtedness, the public indebtedness, private indebtedness as well. We have become a community that has become very mindful of the way we go around with our financial development. We have not allowed excessive financialization of our economies, so that there will be so many excessive speculations that destroy the real sector rather than promote the real sector. We've become a group of economies that have been accumulating some of the massive international reserves in the world. So much so that it's become embarrassing because we're not using, the problem is that we have huge reserves, but we're not using those reserves for our own goods. We use those reserves to buy US Treasury bills and bonds and notes, things like that. So I think that is, for me, the kind of very positive point. It's macroeconomic discipline, but we have not yet turned that macroeconomic discipline into something that we can jump across, over the hurdle to be more advanced economies.
Dr. Sri, one for you. This is what would you say, and I know education is close to your heart. What is the future of education in ASEAN? How are we addressing challenges such as common language, mobility of talent, and mobility of talent?
Well, I think if you look at the experience throughout ASEAN, education has always been the key to move people out of poverty and into high income. And you've seen many examples inside this room, not just in Malaysia, but also in Indonesia and other countries, in Thailand also in particular. Now, I think as we move forward, you've seen that there are many commonalities, and one of the great strengths of ASEAN is the fact that English is actually very widely spoken in ASEAN, and there's a lot more emphasis on English across the various countries. And again, as we move forward further, the human capital development is also very important. And I think this is where one of the mission or initiatives our Prime Minister is promoting is the ASEAN internship, giving opportunity to ASEAN youth to be able to be seconded or have internships in various companies across the region. That's something which I think we should do. Oliver, if I may, going back to your question about the millennials, there was a recent study done by Deloitte that looked at the aspiration or ambition of the millennials. It's quite interesting in the sense that only 38% of the millennials from the advanced economies wanted to be a CEO or the leader of their respective organizations. Whereas in the case of the millennials from Southeast Asia, 2/3 of them wanted to be a CEO. But in the same breath, the same people are also talking about having work-life balance as being more important compared to hard work and money and so on. So I think there's a bit of a dichotomy there in the sense that my advice to the millennials is that if you want to achieve success in life, which indeed is good, you must be able to actually work a bit harder And don't talk about work-life balance at such a young age of 24 years old. Thank you.
Very good. Gentlemen, we're going to need to wrap up. What I would love to hear from each of you is the one thing, and short and snappy, what is the one thing you would like to see this year in terms of action? Not plans long term. What is the one thing you would like to see this year in terms of action? Perhaps we start from Dr. Sri and we go this way.
With permission, Oliver, maybe three. Number one, I would love to see Bank Mandiri having operations here in Malaysia as the first step towards ASEAN banking integration framework. Secondly, I would love to see the ASEAN time zone to be implemented. I think this is something that had been promoted by Indonesia before, and our Prime Minister, as the chair of ASEAN this year, wanted to actually push this forward. And if you look at it within the context of ASEAN, there's only 3 time zones in ASEAN really. So Myanmar is at GMT plus 6.5 hours. The Thailand, Vietnam, Laos, and Cambodia at GMT plus 7. Malaysia, Singapore, Brunei, Philippines at GMT plus 8. And Indonesia is a bit unique. They have 3 time zones, GMT plus 7, plus 8, and plus 9. So I think we're actually quite close to a GMT plus 8, the position where I think if we can actually all agree, that's something that can be achieved. And once you have a single time zone, that will set us far ahead of European community, and certainly for multinationals that are operating in this room, for the capital market, for the financial system, it would be great to actually have that single time zone. And the third wish that I have is that when it comes to Davos, come 2016, instead of Kishore and myself and Gita having our sessions are always on the sidelines, it would be great to have an ASEAN representative at the main plenary, whether we talk about the global economic outlook or the trend for the future. So I think having an ASEAN represented at the main podium of the World Economic Forum at Davos 2016, that would be great.
Good. Gita.
Well, I agree with Dr. Wahid with respect to the time zone, although I prefer not to wake up earlier tomorrow. But you know, it's going to be challenging for Indonesia, which has been surviving with 3 different time zones. But I think what I'm noticing more and more nowadays is the disconnect between policy making and what the business community aspires. Yes, in the past, we might have had much more decisiveness from the top for the purpose of the connectivity and the togetherness of ASEAN. We may not be seeing that amount as much today, but I think some of us, or many of us, will be exposed at the end of this year, and I just want all of us, or all of you, to be patient. And this could be by way of perhaps the disconnect between the policy-making thinking and the business community thinking and doing, but also by way of what we're seeing in terms of the democratization that Kishore has referred to. You know, sometimes people, when they're in the government, they tend to have to be sounding a little more nationalistic than ever, a little more nationalistic than the other guys, and that causes a bit of a dissonance to the business community. On top of the fact that when this gate opens up, I think it's going to create a bit of a situation that some may not be prepared for. And I think that's going to require a lot of patience and recognition of the long-term benefits of ASEAN.
Thank you. Dr. Supachai.
Yes, for me, there are 3 things that ASEAN absolutely need to execute this year. 3 things: infrastructure, infrastructure, and infrastructure. Infrastructure investment. We talked a lot, our leaders talked a lot about infrastructural investment, connectivity and connectivity. But there is never an action plan. There is never an action or a project that has come on the table and agreed upon. So I would like to see this year, if you look at ASEAN record on infrastructure investment, it's 2% of GDP, 3% GDP, 5% of GDP, whereas we need 10% of GDP for at least the next 10 years. So stop talking. And let's say, and I mean infrastructure, not only roads and railways, but also education services, health services, logistics, energy, grid work, electricity. I think we need to agree this year. I think we already have agreed something somewhere to set up an infrastructure fund. We must be able to set up an ASEAN infrastructure fund with the reserves from the government and pass from the private sector or float the bonds or something to create the funds and agree on a set of, let's say, 10 infrastructure projects that would cover all the 10 ASEAN countries. And then I would believe in the kind of hype that I would believe in for the future of ASEAN. Thank you.
Yeah, I mean, I certainly agree with the suggestions that have been made. I like the idea of a single time zone, because a single time zone will be a kind of create suddenly an awareness among the people of ASEAN that they're actually finally on the same boat together, regardless of you're right, the capital markets would benefit and all that, but the psychological impact in terms of creating a sense of community would be phenomenal. And that's why I hope we can at least achieve that as a minimum. And I certainly agree with Supachai also on the infrastructure story. But here we are lucky that the Chinese have announced the Asian Investment Infrastructure Bank. We can work with that, and that will create a tremendous source of capital. But I think the most important thing that we have to do this year in ASEAN, and by the way, 2015 is going to be a very, very, very critical year for ASEAN. It either takes off or it doesn't. And if it's going to take off, it's only going to take off if we can persuade the leaders of ASEAN, just for this year, make ASEAN their #1 priority. Because this is such a critical year for ASEAN. Because sometimes, if you miss the takeoff, you know what happens to a plane. You get into trouble. And while I agree with Gita that we have a situation where the leaders are becoming much more internally focused, they can do that, and they have to do that. They have to sound nationalist. They have to make the nationalist voices. But behind that, when they look at their own responsibilities as leaders of ASEAN, I hope they will realize that history will judge them on the basis of what they do in 2015.
Thank you. So, ladies and gentlemen, two things. Number one, we had a poll going whilst we were talking, does ASEAN deserve the hype? And that has moved. I think we're now in the high mid-90s % saying yes, it does. And that has moved significantly during this conversation. So you guys are clearly doing a very good job of convincing the folks. And the final one, I'm not going to summarize, but I'm going to quote Dr. Supachai, which is, let's stop talking and start doing. I think that is the key thing for this year. Let's stop talking and start doing. On that note, ladies and gentlemen, please give the 4 distinguished speakers a big, big hand.